En kort 20 sekunder om den. En del av SVFFs utbildningsprogram numera. Och som jag sa så startar andra rundan nästa vecka. För att utbilda specialister inom det här området. Är man intresserad mer om den så finns den på SVFF eller svenskfotboll.se och sen övriga tränarutbildningar som ni också kommer att få ta del av efteråt. Ja. Behörighetskraven påbörjad/avslutad UEFAB och sen övriga meriterande kompetenser görs ett urval från det. För att återigen öka antalet fotbollsvis tränare ute i Sverige. Ett urval av innehåll och olika delar kopplat till träningsprinciper för de olika fysiska grundkvaliteterna. Monitorering, skadeförebyggande strategier, fotbollspsykologi, periodisering och så vidare. Ser fram emot en spännande utbildning och start som jag sa då mars 2022. Så nästa tillfälle igen är om ett år. Ansökan till detta kommer ut under hösten. FOFU ut till A-landslag kommer inte ta så mycket mer om här nu, utan det är ett pågående arbete, så att det ber för att komma till det när det finns fler tillfällen. Forskningssamordnare kommer idag ta upp lite mer att knyta alla de här olika organisationerna ihop, forskningen och klubbarnas verksamhet, men också slå ett slag för Peter Brusvik då, som har forskat framförallt då på breddnivå också. Så att man har en tudelad tjänst där, eller ambition om att föra forskningen närmare fotbollen och vice versa. Sverige inom fotbollsvis tror vi att det finns ett bra forum att samverka och föra närmare varandra genom sådana här nätverksträffar. Och vi har hållit dem lite historiskt sedan 2019 och vi hoppas att vi kan få möjlighet att få träffa er live från och med i höst, när vi förhoppningsvis kan anordna mer än fysiska aktiviteter. Men så länge så nöjer vi oss, eller har den äran att kunna erbjuda sådana här träffar online, som Dan nu har på ett väldigt bra sätt fått ihop den här träffen. Därmed så slutar jag att dela mitt innehåll eller bidrag till kvällen, och ni får gärna kontakta mig eller Dan om det är någonting ni har frågor om kopplat till fotbollsfys i allmänhet och även de olika delarna som fanns inom elitprojektet. Tack.
Tack Johan. Då ska jag fortsätta dela min skärm här. Och så ska jag bara, hoppas ni kan se den där. Bara tänker snabbt dra lite, för det är inte så många som vet om detta. Men så som vi har jobbat med under en tid nu och få till forskningssamordning. Ni vet att det är mycket fotbollsforskning runt om i världen, och vilken som är viktig för oss i Sverige och utifrån elitprojektets då, målsättning och vision. Så har vi kommit fram till, eller vi har jobbat med en rad olika arbetssätt för att, som Johan sa, föra forskningen närmare praktiken och tvärtom kanske. Så vi har jobbat med infographics. Allt det här finns på hemsidan där, på SVFFs hemsida. Om vi klickar vidare till elitprojektet och sen forskning och forskningssamordning, så har ni ett antal länkar där ni kan klicka på. Men där ligger ett antal infographics, och de är såna sammanfattningar av fotbollsforskning som vi har valt ut utifrån våra grupper på SVFF och elitprojektet, och har sammanfattat olika delar inom fotbollsfys, fotbollspsykologi, future team och fotbollspsykologi kanske, men fotbollsanalys också då. Och det kommer vi fortsätta göra, och det kommer öka. Nu har vi hittat ett sätt som är en av de andra punkterna, en forskargrupp som vi ska försöka få ihop här under våren, som ansvarar, där en svensk fotbollsforskare ansvarar för varje område och tar fram det viktigaste och tar fram det mycket snabbare än att jag eller vi som har tagit fram det nu. Så att det går mycket effektivare att få ut informationen om ny forskning ut till er klubbar, och ni kan läsa dem snabbt och enkelt och på svenska. En annan del är det vi sitter här nu. Det är webbinarier där vi nu har tagit hjälp av J-B som är väldigt framstående inom forskning om sprint performance, training and testing inom elitfotboll. Och vi har haft 4-5 andra webbinarier och nätverksträffar där andra forskare och praktiker har pratat. Och det kommer fler under våren. Vi har svensk forskning till exempel på ungdomselitnivå, skador relaterat till extern belastning, relaterat till wellness och så vidare som kommer komma. Vi har biobanding-projekt inom Future Team som kommer komma resultat nu under våren, och även inom fotbollsfysiologi då med de här intensiva perioder under elitfotbollsmatcher, hur vi kan använda dem för att mäta vår träning och se om vi tränar matchspecifikt och så vidare. Och det är även några av de här som jag nämnde nu som har pågått då under 2 år nu som forskningsprojekt där vi börjar få resultat. Forskargruppen nämnde jag. Kommer vi försöka få till nu att sätta den ungefär i maj 2022. Vi kommer också sikta på att försöka kartlägga och sammanfatta väldigt kort den svenska fotbollsforskning som förekommer. Och det har vi precis börjat med. Men så att den också är tillgänglig för er och lätt att förstå och tolka på vår hemsida då. Och sen en sista sak som ligger på bordet nu som jag sitter och jobbar med, det är ett Football Science Internship där vi tänker rekrytera, vi tänker göra ett speciella samarbete med till en början ett fåtal universitet där de har master eller magister eller kandidatprogram i idrottsvetenskap med olika inriktningar. Där studenter som är fotbollsintresserade kan söka in till det här internshipet. Och det kommer starta hösten 22. Men jag kommer lägga ut det beroende på, det är inte klart vilka universitet det handlar om. Jag kommer lägga ut det på hemsidan, och information om det kommer ni kunna hitta där nu senvåren och maj-juni. Så om man är intresserad av att göra praktik på Svenska fotbollsförbundet och ta del av SVFs metodologier gällande landslagen eller sådär, eller vara med på göra sin kandidatuppsats eller masteruppsats inom ramen av våra forskningsprojekt, så är man intresserad av det så kan man absolut söka, och det kommer mer info om det. Vill ni läsa mer om forskningsprojekten eller mer detaljer så klipp in den här länken. Jag kommer skicka ut det senare efter det här webbinariet. Och som Johan sa, har ni några frågor angående de här sakerna så kontakta mig eller Johan så svarar vi gärna. Okay. Now I'm going to switch to English. Very warm welcome to you, J-B.
Hi, good evening.
Hey, I'm going to introduce you, J-B. I think everybody saw the invite, but J-B is a researcher and professor in sport science and biomechanics, and has done a lot of work in sprint testing and training and testing in sports, elite sports, and also a consultant and advisor of many sports organizations, but some of them are elite football organizations. So now we have past 5 minutes of the agenda, JB. So I'm going to ask you to share your screen, and you can start presenting the very interesting topic.
Cool, thank you very much. you need to confirm that you can see my slides, and then I'm gonna start. Whoops.
Yes.
I did something wrong. Here, you see my presentation.
Yeah. Looks good.
Okay. So thank you very much. Feel free to interrupt if there is a technical issue or something. I'm very, very happy to be speaking with you tonight because yes, I love football. Basically, that's the number one reason for me to collaborate with football people. I was a football player myself when I was young. I was a goalkeeper, but that counts as football player, right? And so today we're going to talk about testing sprinting. So we're going to have two parts. The first half will be about, let's say, a classical way of testing plus a novel way of testing with the force, velocity, mechanical outputs. And the second part will be a novel type of testing that does not imply a specific test. So that's going to be the most innovating part. So if you want to connect with our research, you can go to my website, jbmorin.net. Everything is free and open. And there's a lot of resources there, tutorials, podcasts, videos, and so on. And if you want to follow what's new on social media, Twitter and Instagram, basically. So here we go. So what I'm talking about when I say classical field methods is very simply how do we assess, and so how do we train after that the sprint acceleration performance. So if you start very basic, and if I ask you how do you assess sprint performance, I think you're going to end up with time and speed. Because time and speed, time over a given distance, like, I don't know, a 20 or 30 meter test, and speed, like maximum running speed, typically, are the two main metrics. So if I ask 100 coaches what they assess, for those who assess something, I think I will get time over a given distance or the maximum speed. And when you test players, as you can see in the picture here, when you test players, that's the only thing they want to know. Who is the fastest? They don't care about anything else. Okay, I've never seen a pro player asking me who is accelerating the most. They all care about top speed. Okay, so there are a lot of ways to assess time and speed, as you can see here, and I guess you know all of them. The 1080 motion, the 1080 sprint, that is a Swedish device. Timing gates, GPS units, and so on. And so the story started here. So these are very classical ways to assess speed. And in 2016, we've discussed a method and a way, an approach to go a bit more in detail than just the time or just the speed. Because we realized that just the time or just the speed was not sometimes a good enough information. It was even sometimes misleading. Okay, so of course, on the pitch, what you want is the players to get the ball first, the players to put their arms first, or the players to run fast like Mbappe and score goals. I'm just asking everybody to turn the
J-B, you're currently on mute.
Yes.
Someone has muted me. Now it's better?
Now we can hear you, yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So, but I can still hear someone. So I guess maybe we can check quickly the list, but I can hear some kids playing in the background, and these are not my kids. Okay, anyway, it's no big deal.
We'll keep track of that. So
yeah,
you can...
we'll find the kids.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, JB, for that. Please
yeah,
continue.
no, it's no issue. So yes, the approach that we decided to take is a macroscopic one, and we follow the path of our mentors and influencers in the field of biomechanics, Professor Di Prampero and Professor Alexander. And Professor Alexander said, when you want to model something in the biomechanics field, is it locomotion, is it jumping or running, any performance, you want to start with a very simple model. You want to start simple, because when the model is simple, you have a clear view of the essential features to the calculated effect or to performance. So the macroscopic model is, we see the player as a unit that is moving forward. But at the end of the day, you don't need to go much more into details, because you can go into the muscle fiber typology, you can go into the rate of force development, you can go into the tendon slack and stiffness and very, very, very detailed things. But first, you have to start with the big picture. And the big picture is very simple. The big picture is summarized here. So I will stay a few minutes on this slide because it's the most important one. This is a 30-meter test in an elite football player. And if you look at the left of the graph, this is the speed, okay, from 0 to top speed. So first, you see that the speed is not increasing linearly. So this is a very, very big mistake that some coaches do. People think that at half of the distance, you reached half of your maximum speed. This is not the case. So the speed is increasing a lot at the beginning. And you can see that 50% of the maximum speed, so around 5 meters per second, are produced within 1 second or 5 meters. So it means that during the first second, you generate half of your final speed, okay? So this is very important because when you calculate the force output, so when you calculate the force in the running direction, you see that the force output is very high at the beginning and the force output is decreasing as you increase speed. This is the human physiology. And when you multiply the force in the horizontal direction by the running speed, you have an idea of the quasi-power. So I say quasi-power because power is not the real product of force and speed, because force is multidirectional. But here, we only focus on the direction of motion. So we only focus on the very small part of power that is pushing the body forward. But that's what is interesting in football. What you want to do is to be first in the forward direction. So when you do that, you have an idea of the power, and you see that the power has a peak within the first second, and then power decreases. So now if you go to the graph that's on the right, if you plot running speed, sorry for the French here, vitesse de course, but if you plot running speed as a function of the horizontal force, so you plot the black trace here as a function of the gray trace here, you have something that is linear, okay? Because the speed is increasing exponentially, and you multiply the exponential by its derivative very shortly. So you have something linear. Keep in mind, we will see it after, that when you measure things in a laboratory, this is exactly what you obtain, okay? So this is what we call the force velocity profile. And we call it profile because it's a relationship that is the same for everybody. So it's linear and from F0 to V0 for every player. But we call that a profile because it's in fact very different for every player. So the orientation of the relationship and the F0 and V0 are very different depending on the players, okay? And finally, when you multiply force by velocity, you have an idea of power as a function of speed. And you see that the maximum power is produced at a speed that is around 50% of the maximum speed. Okay, so get that picture. When you start from 0, you go to top speed, you go through this entire profile. And this is, for us, the first step after just timing. Because when you just time people, when you take their performance, you don't know this story, okay? So this is, to me, the second step towards explaining performance. So to give you a very, very direct example, this is an example I got from elite rugby, but we will soon go back to elite football. We are following many elite rugby players in France, including the national team. And here is an example of a test that we did. And we have 3 players with exactly the same 30-meter time. So 30 meter is pretty short. It's the distance that typically elite football players or rugby players need to get to their top speed, okay? And you see that the 3 players have the same performance, 440, 442, 441. So you might say, well, okay, they have the same sprint capability, and that's it. But when you go to their FV profile, so when you calculate things, you see that one of them has a very high F0 and a very low V0. So green is better than the median of the team, so he's in the top 50%, and red is below the median of the team. So he's a very force-oriented guy. The other one is a very velocity-oriented guy because he's very low on F0 and very high on V0. And the final guy here is well-balanced. He has good numbers on both F and V. And so it means that the story of these 3 guys is that if you put them on the starting line together, they will finish the race together at 30 meters. They will cross the 30-meter line together, but inside these 4 seconds, there's going to be very different patterns. And so this is why I think it's important to know this, to assess that, because for us, first, it means on the pitch, they will have very different capabilities depending on short or long actions. And so we think that they will need and they will respond to different types of training. This is the philosophy. And so this is, for example, football players, the rugby players again. So I've plotted their profiles here. So you see very high F, very low V, and different for the other guy. And our approach is to say, because they have different strengths and weaknesses in their profile, maybe they will respond better to different types of training. Because, for example, this player who is very, very fast, maybe he will not respond a lot to a very high-speed oriented type of training. And maybe he will respond more to a force-oriented type of training. And this is on the right side, the ratio of force, that is the effectiveness, the orientation of the force onto the ground. And you see that they have very different patterns. And my experience now with football and rugby is that you can do some clusters. You can find some groups of players with the same pattern, and you want to train them accordingly. So just for you to know, we've been doing that in that elite rugby club in France for 3 seasons, and we are going to now work on the publications because for 3 seasons, we started individualizing, grouping the players, and for some part of their training, they do different stuff depending on their profile. But let's go back to football. This is a very cool example that we've collected during a practical session with French football coaches years ago. It was in 2012, okay? So that's 10 years ago. We do a sprint test, okay? So if I could be with you today in Sweden, we would have done a sprint test, 40 meter. The guys, one is 6:21, the other one is 6:37. This was measured with timing gates. Well, you might say, okay, 6:37, you're pretty slow. 6:21, you're fast, and you're better at sprinting. And that's the end of the story. And if I ask you, how would you coach these 2 guys? I think you would give me the same type of training. And maybe you would say, this guy is slow, so he will need more sprint training. But that's it. Now, if you look at their profile, this is another story. If you look at their profile, Frank, that is the slow guy on the 40-meter test, Frank, in fact, has a very high maximum speed. His V0 is 9.1, so it means he's faster than the other one. But at the end of the race, at the end of the 40-meter test, and to be very, very accurate, he's crossing the finish line faster. But at the very beginning, on the force side of the curve, he has a clear difference with the other guy. So it means if you look at their test, Frank is losing a lot at the beginning because he has a low force acceleration, but when he's able to run, he's running super fast. Now you need to understand something that is key. the story is totally different, because I think that Frank actually maybe doesn't need maximum speed work in his training, or maybe less. I would put the emphasis, I would put the focus in training on force output, very high force, not very high speed. And so if I don't know that, maybe I will do some mistakes in my training program. And maybe I will insist with Frank, you're slow, do more speed, you're slow, do more speed. He's not responding because he's fast and it doesn't work. Now, if the test is longer, what will happen? If the test is a 100-meter test, maybe Frank will be better, because if he is able to keep this maximum speed longer, he will beat the other guy. And if the test is shorter than 40 meters, if my test is a 20 meter, the gap between the two will be even bigger. So it means my interpretation of the players depends on the test I do. This is wrong, in my opinion, because I don't want to have the different story if I do a different test. And in my opinion, doing the force velocity spectrum profile is you get the full story. And that's the reason why I think you get a more efficient type of training, because you're going to know what is good and what is not, and you're going to be able to program better. Now, just let's say a mathematical modeling of the entire story. So these are theoretical players that have been generated according to our models. We will see in a minute that we have validated these models clearly so we can simulate things. And my friend Pierre Samosino, in a paper that's been published a few months ago in Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science in Sports, is showing the very clear things here. You can have the same 5-meter time. So these 3 players here have the same 5-meter time. They have very different FV profiles. You see what I mean? So you can have the same split time at a given distance, but different FV profiles. And now if you look at the 30-meter time, this is what I explained you just before. These 3 theoretical players have the same 30-meter time, or roughly the same, okay? And they have very different profiles. So it means split times is, in my opinion, it's a rough idea of what's going on. It tells you the performance. It doesn't tell you the reasons, the mechanical underpinnings of performance. And when you want to train people, you don't train people to be performant. You train people to develop the physical capabilities that make them performant. You see what I mean? And so we think that profiling will help you better identify the individual mechanical capabilities to develop. Otherwise, life is simple. You want to improve at the 30-meter, do some 30 meters, but that's, very basic training. It may work with young people, with people who never sprint. You will have results, but at some point, the results will plateau, definitely, especially at the elite level. Now, the methods. How can you do? Well, very simply, if you want to do an FV profile, you have to measure force output and running speed. And to do that simultaneously, you can use force plates, but there's only 2 places like this in the world, 2 or 3 places where you have force plates in the ground. You can use instrumented treadmills, but there's 2 places in the world like this, and I'm very lucky I work in one of them in Saint-Etienne. But it's pretty cool. This is a sprint of my colleague, Pascal. He's a medical doctor working with me, and this is our treadmill. And there we measure the running speed, and we measure the ground forces at every step. This is pretty cool. But as a coach, as a physical coach, this is super frustrating because you will almost have no chance to access to that. So the idea we had with Pierre Samosino, again, it was 10 years ago. We wanted to compute the force output in the sprint direction based on velocity measurements. Because a century ago, physiologists observed that when human people run at their maximum intensity, the speed increases in a very, very classical exponential way. So it's fascinating. You can summarize the speed outputs of any athlete, if they give their max, with a very simple exponential equation that is described here. So this has been observed for a century. This is systematic. It works with elite athletes. This is a French European champion. It works with football players. I use this as a way to avoid cheating in the test. When I test players or athletes, I tell them, give your max, because if your velocity doesn't show this curve, I know it was submaximal, and it works because they give their max. The record of the 100-meter follows this exponential function. Of course, the characteristics of the function are different between Usain Bolt, for example, and myself, but the mathematical exponential function is the same. This is my boy. When he was 3 years old, I told him, run very fast, and I measured him with the radar, and he's following the exponential function. This is a very old sprinter, 96 years old, that we measured at the competition. And so this exponential model is something we cannot disagree on. This is how it happens, okay? So from that model, we just use very simple Newtonian dynamics to calculate acceleration based on the velocity. And when you get acceleration in the forward direction and you know the body mass, you can calculate the net force output that has been produced, because the laws of Newton say there is a direct proportion between force, body mass, and acceleration. So at the end of the day, in this method, we calculate force and velocity. And so we're able to calculate the force velocity profile just from position or speed data. Just for you to remember, we validated this method against force plates in 2016 in this paper. But because it was on several different sprints, we validated the method again in 2019 in this paper, because we collaborated with my colleagues in Japan, because they have a 60-meter force plate track. This is unique. It's the only one in the world. And I told them, please do some measurements, and we calculate them, and we try to test the validity of the model. And so the model is valid, it's reliable, and all you need is speed as a function of time. So as I said at the beginning, there are many ways to measure speed or position as a function of time. Timing gates, radar, lasers, the 1080 machine, and my friend Pedro Jimenez designed an app that maybe you know, that is called MySprint. And MySprint is doing exactly what the French biomechanist Etienne Jules Marais was doing more than a century ago. You film people moving. And when you know the time between two frames and you know their position in space, you can recalculate their running speed very simply. So because today the iPhones and iPad have a very, very high speed camera, 240 frames per second, we can set some markers, and we can very, very accurately, if it's done correctly, as always, measure the split times. Because as you know, 6 pairs of timing gates is very expensive. So this app has been validated against timing gates. We did a revalidation with my students to be really, really confident in using the app. And we generated some Excel spreadsheets because we realized that, in my opinion, the app is very accurate to measure the split times, but to calculate everything after that, it's not very user-friendly. So we generated an Excel spreadsheet that's free. I think it's been downloaded 100,000 times. And I'm very happy with that, because at least people can generate AV profiles and go deeper in their training and assessment only based on the split times. So now I'm going to speak about methods a little bit, because this is very, very important. So the first source of error is the device that you use for speed or position time. So if you use timing gates, that's fine, but you need to have a lot of times to have a clear view of what's going on. So if you use only 2 timing gates, that's not enough. And in this very cool study by Thomas Haugen from Norway and Pierre Samosino, they compared the force velocity outcomes with different combinations of split times. So they went down to only 3 split times, and they checked if the outcomes were different. You see what I mean? So their conclusion is very clear. They show that you can't be accurate if you have less than 5, 10, 20, and 30 meter times. This is the minimum. So you can't be accurate if you just have 2 times. So you need at least 4, and these are the 4. And 5 meter is a non-negotiable because, as I said at the beginning, speed is increasing very, very quickly. So you can't miss this very important part. And the problem is that with the timing gates, the question is, how do you start timing? Because usually when you time people in football with the timing gate, you have a first pair of timing gates ahead of the player that is going to trigger the timing. But even if this timing gate is very close to the body is already moving pretty fast when you trigger the time. So there is an overestimation of the 5 and 10 meter times relative to the rest. And there is an overestimation of F0 and Pmax. So you need to be aware of that, and you need to have a system that is starting the time when the movement starts, because that's what the model is about. So we are now comparing all the devices, so the timing gates, the app, the laser, the radar, and so on. But my main message is very simple. Whatever the device you use, you need to respect first the accuracy of the positioning and the accuracy of the timing. Because with this type of model, a very small error in the measurement can lead to very large errors in interpretation. The second source of error, it's source of error number 2, it's the raw speed that you are using. So whatever the device you use, if it's a radar, if it's the 1080 sprint, you need to always verify that your speed data are fitted correctly by the exponential model. Because if it's not the case, it means that the device was not correct or the sprint was not maximal. But in both cases, if the exponential fitting is not perfect, as you can see here visually, and this is a visual inspection, you know that the outcomes will not respect the model and they will be wrong, definitely. So the final source of error, and to me it's the most important one, is the players. They need to be familiar with sprint tests and they need to have a very good technical start. So what does it mean? It means they need to have a clear start. You can have a 2-point or a 3-point start. They need to have no pre-go movement. So it means they need to be in a position and boom, start in one movement. And they need to have an all-out push. So this, my experience with football players is that some of them really need some familiarization, but they all succeed. So if you want to test a team, first, you have to be very, very rigorous in the familiarization, okay? Because again, it will have a major influence on force and power output. So some players have crazy high numbers just because of measuring or sprinting mistakes, not because of their physical capabilities, okay? So you want to avoid that. But this is not due to the model. This is due to the methods used. So finally, we did a lot of studies, and the story is this one. First, you measure speed, then you model the speed, and then you calculate F and V, okay? That's the idea. So you can do that on the field. We've shown, and some colleagues showed that it was also working with ice hockey acceleration. And again, as I said, if the movement is maximal, then the outcomes are okay. So you can assess the players. You can use that during the rehab. So for example, if you know the numbers, you can use that in rehab. You can monitor, and I think it's very important. You can use that in training. For example, you want to see the effect of any type of training. You do some pre-post measurements. You can see the effect of fatigue. You can maybe use that in prevention. For example, if the profile of the player is suddenly changing and you don't know why, maybe there is something going on, and so on. So if you want to know all our studies on that, you can go to my website for the details. Now I will show you the main interest, in my opinion, is to follow up, is to have a follow-up of the players. So as you can see here, with some clubs we've collaborated with, we did some monitoring every 2 months. Okay, some clubs even do in rugby every month. You just need a sprint. So I know sometimes in football it's very difficult to have a sprint, but that's the story, and it's going to be the reason for the second part. But when you have a sprint, you have a line of number and you have an idea of the profile of the player, and this will help you with the training content. And in my opinion, the first injury prevention program is the training content management, because most non-contact injuries are very likely a mistake of training content that is not corresponding to the player's capability. Okay, so for example, here in this very cool paper of Caroline Finch and her colleagues, they say the key concept behind monitoring training load, so training load and the profile of the players, is to screen the players at increased risk so that the load can be adjusted. So the idea is very simple. If you have a player that has a very high V0 and a very low F0, maybe you can adjust the training load so that they do a bit less of maximal speed, because that's what they really have in their profile. So maybe you just need to maintain that, and you need to push on what they need to develop, which would be their F0. So in the table you see here, this is my work with a rugby club. We have all the players, all the variables, and green is in the top 50%, red is in the bottom, and at the end of the day, we group the players. For example, all the players who have a low V0, if they need it on the pitch, that's very important. The context is always king. If you need more speed and you have a low speed, then yes, we are going to try and program more speed work for you. But maybe if you don't need maximum speed, or if you already have very high numbers, maybe we will just maintain or modulate. The overall idea here is to modulate the training according to the players or the group of players. I know it's difficult because it's very easy to have one program for 20 guys, more than 5 programs for different groups. But believe me, the coaches who starting working like this, they could. So it means it's possible. And the players, this is the most important story in the rugby club I worked with for 3 years. The players, they don't want to go back to what they did before. They want some individualized training. And when they change club and we have them on the phone, they say, wow, it's a pity. We all do the same now, and it was much better before, okay? So for example, here, this is a description of the changes in the force velocity profile during the season. This was done in elite Spanish football players. This was the club of Granada in Spain. And so they could follow pre-season and 1, 2, 3, 4 times in season, the force velocity profile. So what you see here is very important. First, there is a group tendency. So F0, you can see here F0 and V0 on the top panels. F0 changes for the group during the season. You see a clear drop in season after the second assessment. This is the first information. But the second information that's very important is that there are many different individual stories. So it means there is an average trend for the team, but within that average trend, there are some very different changes between the players. So it means some players will develop and improve. Some players during the season will crash. You want to know that because we've seen that, and I won't talk about that today, but we've seen that players who had a drop in F0 during the season were subject to more hamstring injuries. So there was a relationship between the low F0 at some point in the season, not in preseason. Preseason is just a very, very, very low level of information. What you measure in July, it doesn't mean anything for April or March the year after, okay? So when you measure things regularly in season, you can see some red flags and you can see some things ongoing, okay? So now, based on that, you want to train the players. So what we did in the last, our first study on that was 2017. So that's 5 years. In the last 5 years, with very, very smart people like Matt Cross or Johan Lahti from Finland, we published some studies, training studies with football and rugby players, in which we addressed this question: what training inputs can we use to develop specific components of the FV spectrum? So this is very important. As coaches or physical prep, we know that training is multifactorial and it's a puzzle. But as researchers, we need to focus for each study on one piece of the puzzle. We cannot assess everything every time. So I am fully aware that every research is focusing on one part of the puzzle, but if we show some results, for example, of heavy sleds to develop F0, it doesn't mean that we want everybody to use heavy sleds. It just means, okay, if you want to develop F0 for the reasons I've described before, then yes, heavy sleds will be, or high resistances will be the method to use. And so that's the responsibility of the coach, to assess the players and then to go into research and say, okay, this method is working. Yes, we will use it for this specific objective. Okay. So now I'm gonna close the first part before your questions with this big problem, very big problem, and you know it. And honestly, I was an athlete myself and a coach, and I couldn't imagine when I started researching in football how problematic it was to ask for sprinting. We can discuss that for hours, but it's a fact. When you say to know your profile and orient the training or prevent injuries and help you, I need you to sprint 30 meters all out. Whoa, at least in France, people get very, very scared because a test is a stress. And this is a fact. Even in rugby, where people are, let's say, more sprint friendly, okay, they are less afraid, okay, when do we sprint? It's still a stress. My experience is that I have had no player getting injured during one of my FV testing, and I did a lot, but still, I understand now, at the beginning of my career, this was driving me crazy. I was like, they sprint on the pitch during the entire game and they don't want to do a 30-meter test, what the hell? But now I understand it's a stress because it's a culture that needs to change. So the second part, after a little break in your questions, will be our solutions to maybe avoid such a test. My deep inside myself, I don't want that. I want people to be okay with sprinting and okay with the sprint test, just like they are okay with the maximum aerobic test. When you ask the players, they say, but they do it. But when you ask them to sprint, there's an issue. But we've tried to develop a method to go around this limitation. So that's the first part of the talk, and so we can go to your questions.
Thank you, J-B. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions here. One from Jon Mörner. A question regarding which quality should be emphasized in your experience. When, if ever, should you train on your weaknesses?
Yeah, so it depends on where your weakness is, actually. So the idea is, if you want to tackle the weaknesses, my objective in training is to try and keep the strengths, because it's important, but keep in mind that eventually, at the end of the day, the performance will be limited always by my weaknesses. So I want to address that. So the idea is very simple. If you spot a weakness in the profile, that's where you need to push. But I need to say that there's a debate in the scientific field where people say, well, you don't care about AV profile and weakness. You just do some power with everybody, and you're going to be okay. And I agree with that, because if you give me some players, young players, low-level people, and I do power for everybody, I will be a good coach because they will all sprint better. But when they get older, at a higher level, it will not work anymore. So you will have to dig deeper into where is the last weakness I need to unlock to go there. Then in terms of programming, that's a huge question. What should we do? All out on the weakness? This is not something I find interesting. So my point is, with the rugby club we work with, it's very simple. They have 2 speed sessions per week. So very short sessions, like 40 minutes. One speed session is common to all the players. They all do the basics. They all do the same stuff. And one speed session is different. So there, in that second speed session, they tackle the weaknesses. And of course, during the season and during the life of the player, the weaknesses change if they adapt correctly. So you re-question the puzzle always if the players adapt.
Okay, and if you would say something about when in a football environment, when in relationship to the game, would you put the speed sessions, or are you putting your speed sessions?
2 games per week are very difficult, especially if the players sprint a lot on the pitch. I think this will depend a lot on what the players produced on the pitch. If they did a lot of work, all distances, as we will see in the second part, then maybe they're playing too much and there's nothing you can change. But if they only play 1 time per week, I think that some very interesting sessions can be done with short sprints, high resistances, long before the game, and high speed closer to the game. I think that nothing in the 2 days before the game is a mistake, because you can do some very short, very intense, good quality work ahead of the game. For example, day -1 or day -2, if you do some resisted sprints where the players don't go fast, because by definition they don't go fast, you will have some very intense force in sprint output stimulus and no high speed, so no risk of hamstring muscle, small damages and so on. So, and this is something that is unexplored, in my opinion, to my knowledge. In most of the clubs I work with, the 2 days before the game, it was like, okay, tactics and nothing else. But I think there's some track of work there.
Interesting, JB. Okay, next question from Christine Holm Geisdottir. Would you say testing the force velocity curve with counter movement jump, body weight and with weights is as accurate as testing it with sprints?
No, definitely not. So it is accurate. You can get some. So if you get the CMJ versus CMJ plus body weight, you get a good idea of the force velocity orientation, but for sprint exercises. And our studies with elite people show that there is a disconnection between the jump and the sprint profile. And so the orientation of the jump profile doesn't tell you a lot about the sprint profile. And so I am it's very simple to me. If you want to know about sprint mechanics, you want to assess sprinting. That's it. You don't go around with indirect methods. Again, it will work with young people, with kids. Fast kids have a good profile in jumping, but not anymore in high-level people.
Okay. Another question from Davidson Vegard. If the goal is to find out if the athlete is force or velocity based, would it work to do a 5-meter acceleration test and then a 5-meter with flying start, passing the timing gates at max velocity?
So it's about the same idea. If you have my 5-meter time in the start and you compare it to my 5-meter time in the flying test, you have a ratio between early acceleration and top speed. And this ratio is connected somehow to the profile. But first, it doesn't tell you about my force output. It doesn't tell you about my effectiveness. So if I have a good ratio and I'm good at the first 5 compared to the flying 5s, you don't know if it's because I'm strong or if it's because I have a good orientation of my push in the ground. So this is a key. And again, as we've shown in our previous study, you can have the same 5-meter time and different force output, and you can have the same 5-meter flight time and different maximum velocity. So I would say this ratio of times is it's an indirect indicator of the profile, but it doesn't tell you everything.
Okay. Last question before the break. Henrik Karlström, have you been able to assess how much sprinting technique play a part if the player's force output is the same? Can or have you see a clear change by just increasing technique?
So this is the most exciting question we are going to address now. We're going to start a complete PhD program in September at my lab to see what is the connection between the mechanical output, like F0, and the technique. Okay, and we are going to assess athletes and football players because it's an idea around that football players have a less efficient technique than athletes. Okay, but they are football players, so they need something else on the pitch. But what I think is that there are some mechanical ways to be efficient. So, for example, when you run and you touch the ground with your foot ahead of the center of mass, by definition, you generate braking impulse because of the position of the foot according to the center of mass. So a better technique should be that if you reduce that distance, you reduce that negative impulse, and so you improve performance. And the first study to show that was published by Jordan Mendiguchia last summer. We trained people to improve their running technique because we wanted just to know if it was first possible. Can we take some people and address their trunk and leg position during top speed? And the answer was yes, we can change that. But the secondary answer was very interesting. They run faster. So it means it was not our objective, but because we were assessing their entire mechanics, it would have been stupid not to time them, okay? So we timed their 5 and 20 meters, and the intervention group significantly improved 5 and 20-meter time. We did not do any type of sprint training. It was all focused on the pelvis, on the legs, and on the running technique, and performance improved. It was not elite people. This is a point. It was not top-level sprint, top-level football players, but top-level football players didn't accept to be trained for that, so we don't know. But I hope it's going to be the future.
Thank you, JB, for the first part and answering the questions. We can take like 5-minute break, or we can start again 10 past 7.
Yeah.
Is that okay? So
okay.
See you then.
See you after the beer, correct?
Välkomna tillbaka. J-B, you're there. Hi, you can share your screen again and please continue.
Cool. Yep. Okay. All right, so I'll go back to the last slide. That's the reality of our work. We had many issues convincing the coaches to run the tests. And so we started thinking about getting some similar informations without doing a 30-meter test. Okay, so that's the beginning of the story. So this is what we call the in situ approach. So now we say the sprint test, the sprint FV profile, or we say the in situ. In situ, there is no testing. It's testing without testing. So, and I would say that even the players don't know they are testing. They just play football. This is, to me, also psychologically something very different. Okay, because when you do a 30-meter test, I realize that the players are all out. They give their maximum, but you don't really know if there's something more that can be done. But when they're on the pitch and there's a game, you suppose they're giving their max. So the idea came from our COVID discussions. So this is the meeting in the COVID time with Pietro Di Prampero. Christian Osnak in Italy is the Italia U21 SNC coach. My friend Pierre Samosino and some students at my lab, Jan. So this was published in Journal of Biomechanics as a proof of concept. So we wanted to show the concept, to prove the concept, so that people could take it and test the reliability, test the applications, and so on. So we wanted to publish a very short, simple idea. So I'm going to present it now. So the idea of this test is very simple. When players play or when they train, and you follow them with the GPS units, you can generate between 10 and 20 data points per second. So it means that if you just look at the speed, the running speed, and the associated acceleration, so that's very important, it's the acceleration related to that speed, and you have a GPS that is 18 Hertz, like the GPXA Pro 2. So this is very important. The entire approach has been proven and tested with GPXA systems. And they are, in my opinion, very accurate, okay? And this is the cloud of data for 2 weeks in a pro Italian player. So this is 8 sessions of 2 hours. This is a lot. But what you see in this cloud of data, so here I'm just presenting the positive acceleration. I'm just not looking at the negative, the deceleration, but we are working on it. So you see the speed, you see very high speed, low speeds, and so on, and you see accelerations. And what you see is that when you accumulate all the plays, all the efforts, short sprints, long sprints, all-out sprints, you end up with, throughout the spectrum, for each speed, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meters per second, so you see what I mean here, there is a maximum acceleration point or a couple of maximum acceleration points. So it means when the player one day was running at 5, it generated some low accelerations. So this is 5 meters per second positioning, but not all out. But there are 2 points, 3 points at which at 5 meters per second, boom, it was a maximum acceleration. And when you do that with all the speeds, you obtain something that is linear and that is decreasing. So I'm going to show you the regressions after, but the concept is very simple. Your maximum acceleration are produced around 2 meters per second. This is the speed of your center of mass after 1 push or 2 pushes in a sprint, 2 meters per second, boom. And of course, when you run at your maximum speed, you are not accelerating anymore. This is very, very simple. When I am running at top speed, I cannot accelerate. Okay, and so here we have a spectrum that goes from max acceleration to max speed. And the idea is to plot the regression line to describe the spectrum. So in the method, what we do is that we select the two maximum points of acceleration for each 0.2 or 0.1 meters per second down the spectrum from 3, because this is usually the zone of maximum acceleration, to top speed. And when you do this, you have a linear relationship, and you can extrapolate the theoretical maximum speed and the theoretical maximum acceleration of this profile. So here we have A0, that's the theoretical maximum acceleration of this player, and S0, that's the speed, the maximum speed he could cover. Okay, so we did not call that F0 and V0 to avoid confusion, but also because it is not conceptually the same thing. Because what you need to understand is that the different points in this profile maybe have been generated in different training sessions or in different parts of the training session. Of course, when you do a single sprint, this is very cool. When you look at this graph here, the shadow points are the training sessions, and the black points here are a single sprint. So the black points is a 30-meter test. And you see that when you do a 30-meter test, you have almost all the maximum points of your profile, especially at max speed. So it means that when you do a single 30-meter test, you have also an acceleration speed profile. So conceptually, it's the same, except that in a 30-meter test, I give my maximum points during the same 4 seconds. And if I do an in situ profile, I will give my maximum points, but during football and during some football actions. Okay, so this is the overall ID. So the first thing that we did is that we tested this ID with many players and many football sessions. So at GPXA company, they have data for many elite clubs for 10 years. And so we verified that this type of profile was observed systematically. So here is an example of 7 sessions of football for one player, and you have the acceleration speed profile for each session. So one session is 1 to 2 hours. And as you can see here, the different sessions give different profiles. Why? Because maybe in a session, the coach wanted to work more on possession with less maximum speed. You see the session 1? Session 1 is pretty relaxed. There is no maximum acceleration. There is no maximum speed. I think it's something like a recovery session. Now, if you look at session 7, what do you see? Session 7 had a lot of maximum speed sprints because there's a lot of pink points here. Session 6, lot of accelerations. Maybe it was a small-sided game session, etc., etc., etc. And at the end of the day, when you accumulate the data, you have an in situ profile of 2 weeks. So this is what we published in the study. But then discussing with the coaches, we wanted to know, because 2 weeks is pretty large, okay? It's a long period. So we want to know maybe something shorter. So we started to analyze this, and we started to say, can we find an in situ profile for shorter times? And I will give you the answer very quickly. So just to give you an idea, I am a big fan of cycling, and I cycle, and I did cycling in competition, and this idea is already around in cycling. I don't know if you know cycling, but my mentor when I was in masters, Dr. Frédéric Grapp, he's now working with the Française des Jeux team. He had this idea of the power record profile in cycling. What's the idea? Very simple. Instead of doing a test of power, critical power for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, this is very boring. You collect the power data in competition in a race. And when you're a cyclist, you know that during a race, you go through very intense sprints, through long climbs. And so you produce maximum power in very different times. And so if you take the power data of a 5 hours race, you get the individual power time profile. And you get the same profile in competition as you would get with some repeated tests. And so the entire idea of Frederick Grapp was to say, the riders use power meters, perfect. We don't bother them with testing. We take the power that's been measured during the race because we know they race, and we calculate the power time curve from this data. And I think we got the idea of the in situ profile because we were influenced by this testing without testing approach. So now let's go back with a quick example here of how does it work. So this is very important. I'm gonna take this sound off. We only tested that with GPXA systems. And I understand many of you don't use GPXA, but use other types of GPS systems. We will talk about that later. And so here on the platform of the GPS system, I have no conflict of interest. This is not my company and I'm not related. I am friend with them, with the researchers, of course, and we do research with their devices, but it is not my business. And the idea is very simple. You open a session. So this is the software that is related to the GPS. You open the sessions. You have very, very classical metrics that you all know: the time, the distance, the number of sprints. And I guess that this is one of my sessions. So I did a full 45-minute training session all out. I was running a lot. I was the guy on the pitch that was running the most. Maximum sprints, short distances, I was attacking, defending, because I wanted to be sure to generate as many speed points as possible in 45 minutes, okay? So let's see my session. This is my session. I guess there is something like 20 acceleration events. So if you know the metrics, you know I was not joking that day. And the thing is that I will ask the platform to run my in situ profile from this session only, okay? So I'm just clicking on when does it start, when does it end, then the platform will compute my profile and I can visualize the in situ profile for these 45 minutes because we always thought that 2 weeks was a lot. And so we realized that we should take the problem differently. And this is my profile here. So this is the linear regression. So you see it's at least 50 points from maximum acceleration down to maximum speed. So I reached my maximum speed during that halftime, okay, on a ball for a very big attack. And if you look at all the points, because you can display all the points, you can see here my cloud of points. So this is something I will come back to later. It's very, very important that you first check the raw point cloud because you want that cloud of point to make sense. So you see this cloud of point makes sense. You see my top speed or my top acceleration at every speed. You see that my maximum acceleration is around 3 meters per second, which corresponds to my very short sprints. And you see many points that are my running points, but this was submaximal. So this was when I was replacing when I was changing position, defending slowly and so on, walking. This is a lot of walking points, but this is my in situ profile. So my A0, sorry for that, is 7.4 on that day for that session. And my V0 is 7.5. So here you have an idea of my in situ football profile for that training session. Okay, so now we generated a website that is free. It's the website is linked in the paper, and on that website you can download your CSV file. Well, you can upload your CSV file if you have another system than the GPXA system. You just download a template file to format your CSV file with time, speed, and acceleration. I guess there is a size limit for the file, but I guess some people uploaded something like 4 training sessions accumulated, and the website will automatically process your file. And this was coded by one of our PhD students who is a co-author, and we are sure that in this platform, the code is exactly following our paper. So this is very important because, as you will see, there can be many mistakes done by not doing the methods correctly. So at the end of the day, this is the same data that you've seen on the GPXA platform, but it could be some other devices. I exported it as a CSV file and I analyzed it with my website. And the website shows you the cloud of data. So you can verify that the cloud of data makes sense. And this is a cloud that makes sense. You can see the number of points that have been taken for the regression. And you see also that the regression is very high quality. And you can see the A0 and V0 or S0. This is all you need. Okay, so this is free, open, and you can access it. All right. So that's for the demo. And now we will see some other key points around this method. So I'm aware today of several studies using the model. And I hope that people will realize that it's very important that the methods are accurate, because as with any type of model, if you use wrong data, you will get wrong results. And I've seen some crazy stuff on the internet, some people on Twitter posting some R code systems to process the data. And I've seen the picture they posted. There was some crazy stuff. There was some football players running at 15 meters per second. So this is not real, okay? So now the big question, what's the big difference between the classic force velocity profile and the in situ profile? Are they related? Are they the same information? To tell you the truth, today we don't know. The only thing I know is that I did in my football session, at the end of the warm-up, a 30-meter test, because I wanted to compare my classical FV profile to my football in situ profile. And I can tell you also that in 1 week, 10 days, we will do an experiment where we will directly compare the sprint profile to the in situ profile, because right now it has not been done specifically. We have some data where the players have been tested, but a few weeks before or a few weeks after, we want to test them in the same session. So what I did in this session is that I took the GPS data of one of my sprints. This is an all-out sprint at the end. You see the pitch, 30 meters, well, even more, 50, boom. This is the speed data. So I exported the raw GPS speed data. You see that the fitting is very good. This is the fitting of my file. So it means the GPS unit that I was using gives some valid data for the FV analysis. And this is my classical FV sprint profile. The red line here is my football profile on that day. And what I observed, and this is something I talked about on YouTube, and we did a webinar on that, is that my F0 is very close to my A0. So conceptually, it's exactly the same thing, except that one is in meters per second square, the other one is in newtons per kilo, but it's exactly the same. And my top speed on the test was very close to my top speed on the pitch, again, because during some actions, I made sure to run super fast, okay? So the big question now is, can we get the same profile? For example, in a game, I have some game data in France with first league clubs, because in France, we have a very accurate video system in every stadium, okay? They don't have the GPS units, they have a video system. And for the two teams that I've analyzed with the coaches, the the in situ profile is accurate for one game data. One game is enough if it's a super intense game, of course. If it's Conte, for example, yesterday with Chelsea playing, you know that this game will give you a complete profile. You see what I mean? So I'm going to talk about the perspectives now, because there's only been one paper published so far. First, monitoring. So why would it be interesting to monitor? This is some data that have been shared with me from a professional club in Serie A in Italy. It's a team, and it's for one player, it's only one player, 5 months of assessment. well, sorry, no, it's not one player. It's the average of 15 players. But of course, in this average, you can find some specific players. What I want you to see is that 0 is the baseline. So this is the first game, okay? They analyze 1 week, okay? So this is, every point is 1 week of data, training plus game, and it's the 1 week in situ profile. The blue points is V0. So you see the V0 week by week oscillating. The orange points is the A0. So you see the team, this is the team average. And the black line is the slope. So it's the ratio between A0 and V0. If the slope goes down, it means the players have a very good V0, but a lower acceleration or maximum force, and vice versa. And what you see is that from the first game of the season, so this is the end of preseason, overall, through the winter, the players have a profile that goes down. It means that they have a profile that goes towards a good velocity and a bad acceleration, or a low matrix of acceleration. And in this window that is red here, this is very interesting. They observed that the players had a good V0, so it means they were able to reach their top speed correctly on the pitch, and they had an acceleration that was lower. So they had a horizontal force output, a F0, that was lower in football. I don't know if it's by chance, but they also observed 3 hamstring injuries in that time window. So again, this is absolutely anecdotal, but it means that you can connect what happens on the pitch. There is no testing here. Even the players didn't know they were tested because we analyzed this data years after. You see what I mean? Because we didn't have the model before. So there is no testing, but we know the sprint function, the sprint output of the players. Of course, this is influenced by the tactics. This is influenced by the results. When your team loses 3-0 at the halftime, maybe the profile of the second half will be different because the players just drop mentally and so on. But there is context in this in situ profile. The second, so of course, you can monitor whatever you want. You can monitor what happens between on the European season time, what happens when the players come back from international days. This is key. If you have the 1 week before the national team break and the 1 week after the national team break, you can have some crazy differences, and you will see it in the profile. The second part is, I think that the in situ profile can help assess the training effects, okay? So for that, it's very simple. You do any type of training intervention, for example, a running technique intervention or a heavy sled, whatever, and you just have to analyze the football data 1 week before. In my opinion, the unit of analysis is 1 week of training plus 1 game. If you have the data for 1 week of training plus 1 game, you know the profile of the player pretty well on that week, okay? So I'm going to give you a very nice example. We are publishing this now. I hope it will be published soon. So it was made in a rugby club, in a professional rugby club in Italy by Alberto, the physical coach. And he decided to see the effect of sled training, of high resisted sprint training, so very heavy loads. And so in the professional team, he took 12 players, and 6 of them did the classical gym work, so very vertically oriented type of. 6 of them did replaced the sessions by heavy sleds. Okay, very simple, very basic, but elite players. It was in season, and it was a control versus heavy sleds. And for the heavy sleds, they used a load that decreased the running speed by 50% compared to top speed. So this is a load that is in the power part of the spectrum. It is pretty heavy, but not too much. What is very, very, very nice is that for the pre-testing, he could do, the coaches and the players were okay to do a 30-meter test, okay? So they did the classical heavy profile. But for the post-testing, for some reasons, they could not do the test. So he wanted to know anyway. And so he did an in situ profile for 1 week. So what we did in the study is that we took in situ profile 1 week after, and to compare correctly, we took in situ profile 1 week before. Okay, so we compare the rugby profiles of the guys. Concerning V0, it's very simple. It didn't change. So V0 is S0. It's the maximum velocity in rugby during training and game. Sorry for the V0, S0 mistake here. So nothing changed in the control group, and basically nothing changed in the sled group. So this is not surprising because none of these training types is designed to improve top speed. So it's logical to see no change in top speed. But now if we look at the maximum acceleration, so it's the equivalent of F0 in the sprint profile, but it's A0 because it's on the pitch. Okay, so it's what the players do when they play rugby. This is, to me, fundamental. It's essential. It is not a test. It is what they do with the ball or with the opponent. In the SNC group, nothing changed significantly. Okay, the average of the group was unchanged, even a bit lower, and you see very different individual trends. Of course, it's not a very powerful study because it's only 6 players in each group, but it's elite players, so it's more realistic, I guess. And then this is the key result. This is very interesting. In elite rugby players, when you train them with heavy sleds, resisted sprints, they improve clearly, almost all of them, but on average, the statistics are clear. They improve their field acceleration. So it means that in the week after the heavy sled protocol, they were accelerating clearly more in rugby. This is not a sprint test anymore. We are not talking about a 30-meter non-specific test. We are talking about the players when they play. And I think this is the most exciting part of the study, okay? Because when we published some studies about heavy sleds, there was always the limitation, and we are totally aware of that. The limitation of, we know that the players are better at accelerating on a test, but does it transfer to football? Does it transfer to the pitch? We don't know. I think so. Because if you accelerate more on a 30-meter test, I guess you will accelerate more on the pitch. It makes sense to me. But here, we tested what happened on the field. And this is, to me, the very, very innovating stuff. So -4% on average and +7% here. The final point here, can we use that to monitor injuries, okay, rehabilitation? This is, to me, one of the keys. So very quickly, we did some studies with Jordan Mendigucha where we used the sprint profile, so the classical sprint profile, to test the players when they return to sports. And in this first study we've published in 2014, we showed that at return to sports, after a hamstring rehabilitation, the players had the lower maximum power and a lower F0 compared to the control players. But they could sprint very fast. So this was the picture of their profile at return to sports. And 2 months later, all the values were back to normal. So in this first study, we said, okay, the profile is influenced by the rehabilitation. And clearly, the rehabilitation is not perfect, is not complete, because look, the players are okay, the numbers, maybe the strength is okay, but clearly when they sprint, they have a low F0 and Pmax. So we could observe that also with a player with the pre-injury data. This is in this case study, this is a pre-injury profile of a professional football player in Spain. And this is the profile at return to sport. So the guy here, everything goes well. He has a hamstring injury. He comes back after rehabilitation, and you see that he's running super fast, just like before, but his maximum acceleration is absolutely not back to normal. So I think that we can use this as something to guide the rehabilitation towards the pre-injury data, okay? So this is what I call sprint-specific return to play. It's not only about, are you okay today? No pain. It's not only about, is your muscle strong? Because we have some players with good numbers at the testing in the muscle strength and very low numbers in sprinting. So another example in the rugby club of Grenoble in France, one player, we have a pre-injury test data because we monitor. Again, if you don't monitor regularly, you will not have the pre-injury data by definition, because you don't know who will get injured and when. So you need to regularly monitor. And so because we had the pre-injury data of this player, then he gets a hamstring injury. It was an overextension and an overstretch injury. We said to the medical staff, okay, when you think that your rehabilitation is over, you allow the player to do a 30-meter test. Well, no, hey, if you cannot sprint, then the rehabilitation is not over, okay? So everybody on the team was okay, the staff, the medical staff, the physical staff. We tested the player, and when we saw his numbers of F0 and V0 back to normal or close to normal, which is before injury, we said, okay, mechanically speaking, the sprint profile is back to normal. And this player did not re-injure in that season. I don't know if he would have re-injured, but all I know is that the rehabilitation was definitely complete because we took the player back to his profile before injury. So now let's go and see some data that I have from a professional football club in Italy. I think it's a Genoa FC or something. Here, this is exactly the same story. The 1 week profile pre-injury versus after return to play. So this is very important. This is not a sprint test. I think you understood. This is 1 week plus 1 game. What you see here is that the pre-return to play was the blue line here, A0, S0. Then boom, hamstring injury. The player goes for 3 weeks to rehab or something. And when he's back to play, the thing is that you don't tell the medical staff, I want to test the guy in sprinting. You don't tell anything. You just put the GPS, the guy goes, trains normally, and you analyze 1 week of data. What do you see? The 1 week of return to play, the guy is 14% lower on max acceleration. So it means you see it in some balls, he's not running the same, he's not accelerating a lot, and minus 6% in top speed, okay? And this is for player 2. And so this is another player, this is another story. What you see here is that this player, when he came back from rehabilitation, he was a bit better than the other one. So it means they had the same rehab, but when they came back to play, they didn't have the same deficit. So this is important to me because this would mean that the player on the left would maybe need more focus because his rehabilitation is incomplete. This one is pretty okay. But what's very interesting is that I can check the week after, and maybe the week after, the profile is back to normal. This is very, very dynamic. So this is the example of another player. This is in situ acceleration speed profile pre-injury. So this is very simple. You have an injury on that day, 24 of February, boom. You go and you analyze the week before because the week before was okay by definition. And so this is the week before. And when you know the week before and the guy comes back to play, you have the gold information to know what happens. Look at the lines. Week 2 after return to play, he has the blue profile. What do you see? Maximum speed is pretty okay. He's able to run almost as fast as before, but maximum force and maximum acceleration is 5 newtons per kilo or meters per second when he was 8. So clearly, if he's an attacker, he will not get the same type of play. If he's a defender, he's not going to be okay on some actions. And what you see here is that after 2 weeks and 4 weeks, you see his profile coming progressively back to the pre-injury status. So this is very important because it is not a test It is not an indirect variable of what you want. It's the player's action summarized in an acceleration speed profile. And this is, I think, very powerful. So the last part of my talk is about, how can I say that? The limitations. All models are wrong, that's for sure, but some are useful. And so the limitations of the in situ profile can come from the model, of course, but they can also come from the methods, the devices, the protocol, and the analysis. And the paper has been out for only 6 months. So, and believe me, I have seen some crazy things published on social media, people showing some profiles or sending me some profiles. And I saw very, very, very wrong things, but I guess that's life. First, the profile has been validated and described with one very specific type of GPS, the GPXA Pro 2, and another company is processing the data differently. So it means that another company maybe will give some different type of data. You know that all GPS data are not equal, and some companies focus a lot on the data processing, on the quality of the reception, and on the quality of the data sampling. This is the case of GPXA, okay? So if you have inaccurate inputs, for example, if you take some GPS that are 10 years old and only 5 hertz and the reception is not good, you will have inaccurate outputs. So I'm giving you here an example. Someone who processed GPS data, I think it's something like 2 or 3 weeks of rugby. No, I think it was a rugby tournament, a rugby 7 tournament or something. What do you see here? First, the maximum speed point, the maximum acceleration point occur around 5 meters per second. This is not possible. This is not human. When you run at 5 meters per second, it's 18 kilometers per hour. You cannot produce your maximum acceleration. Or you're a machine, you're a moto, you're not a human. Okay, so first, this top of cloud is strange. Second, you see here, there is absolutely no points in the top speed zone. So it means that there is not enough data, the cloud is incomplete, and you see that the number of points in the regression is pretty low. There is something like 20 points here, where we would need something like 50 or 70. So we are going to define, and I published, this is, I guess, the tweet that is on my account. If you look at my Twitter account, this is the first tweet that you see. I made a slide where I said, this is the criteria for a cloud of data that makes sense. So this is incomplete, this is strange. Again, maximum acceleration at 18 kilometers per hour, it's like saying your maximum heart rate will be during the warm-up, not during the 10 kilometers run or the marathon. This is strange, okay? So it doesn't make sense. Here, this is a profile that I saw published by a company that is doing inertial sensors. So I'm not going to cite the company, but they published that on social media. I cannot analyze this data. This is very, very noisy. You see some very big spread between the points, and you cannot do a good regression line here. But this is not GPS data. This is inertial units placed on the back of the player. And obviously, it's not accurate enough. Even if you bought the systems and even if the company says it's accurate, it doesn't. So first, when you have some data, you need to question the quality of the data, okay? And you need to check the entire data cloud. My point is, and I hope that in the research that's going to be published using that model, people will publish the clouds of data. Because if you just publish A0 and S0, we don't know what's behind. We need to know the cloud of data to see if it made sense or not, okay? I saw some, it's not on my slide, but I saw some data that was rectangular. So there was some points all around the place, and there was some maximum acceleration points at maximum speed. Not possible. you cannot have the maximum acceleration point at your maximum speed. You would be a car, not a human runner. Okay, so the model is pretty simple to understand. It's pretty easy to measure, but it doesn't mean it's always easy. Okay, so for now, until some research is published, and we are doing some research with people in football using catapult devices. If the cloud of data makes sense, then yes, the data will make sense. Okay, so this is very, very important. It's a funny sentence that says garbage in, garbage out. The model will give you what you gave as an input. Okay, but the model will always give you numbers. If you upload any type of file in our website, it will generate a profile, because the website doesn't check the quality of the input data. It just applies some equations. Okay, but it has to be applied on good raw data. So what's next? First, is it valid? Is it possible with other systems? Again, as I said, not all GPS systems are equal. Maybe some of you measure the variability of heart rate. You know that with some devices, the variability of heart rate is not valid. It's not good. I am wearing a heart rate sensor at the wrist. If you do sports, and if you do, for example, running and intense training, you know that when you want your heart rate to be measured, you need a belt. You don't need the wrist, because it's not accurate. Okay, so first, is it valid with other systems? And then maybe with the GPXS system, maybe with other systems, you can do anything. Reliability, how does it change with fatigue? How does it change with small-sided games? For example, people say, if you use small-sided games, you can focus more on acceleration. Okay, is it the case? In the numbers, this is going to be an objective proof of that. How does it change during the season? Is it different between players' positions? Well, all the questions you can ask. For example, tactical periodization, the fact that you can stimulate very different parts of the physiological spectrum just by playing football. Do you observe that? For example, maximum speed. Do you really develop maximum speed when you do some specific sessions targeting the speed? So I think that this profile can objectivate, prove or disprove the tactical objective of the coaches and what happens physically in the players. I think this is the most interesting part. Training blocks. For example, you have a mid-season break. You do a training block because you want to improve the maximum speed of the players. Okay, you compare the 2 weeks before, the 2 or 3 weeks after, if you do a tapering period and blah, 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 and you see, do I have an increase in S0 when they play football? And that's it. Okay, you just have to analyze the data. What happens post-injury? I guess that's the thing I showed you. And this is, to me, the most interesting part, okay? Maybe what happens pre-injury? Again, when you know that an injury occurred, you have many variables tested before. You can control them, and you have the in situ profile to discuss. So that's going to be a lot of questions. I just hope that in the next years, people will focus on in situ profiling and answer good questions for the players and for the coaches. But there's going to be always the key question of the quality of the data. I don't know if you're familiar with variability of heart rate or heart rate variability, but to me, it's about the same. Heart rate variability is potentially a very powerful non-testing variable for physiological status, but there has been some crazy invalid things done because it was not measured correctly. But this is not due to the concept of heart rate variability. This is due to how people used it and the methods they used, okay? So I think I will always keep that example of heart rate variability to compare with in situ profiling, because I think it's exactly the same discussion. Thank you very much, Tack, if I understood my Swedish correctly, and it's time for questions.
Thank you, J-B. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting topic, and I get like hundreds of research ideas regarding to this method. But let's start with one question here. You mentioned this one time when we had a meeting. What GPS systems did you do this profiling with, and what do you think? Which one's working, of your knowledge?
Okay, so it's a very tricky question, because when people ask this question, the real question is my system okay? You know, so for now, the GPXA, the most recent GPXA system, so GPXA is an Italian company, are the ones that work for this purpose. So the Pro 2 and the GK ones. I have extended experience with these, and I have seen some data in Catapult, the raw data of Catapult devices, but not always. I have seen some very strange clouds of data because of the reception. So it's not only about the unit, it's about where you are using it. For example, if your team is training around buildings or under a metal frame or something, you can have very wrong data with any system. So, and I've seen some good data with Catapult when the speed was filtered correctly and then derivated to get acceleration. Then I have seen StatSports, the Apex system. The problem with StatSports is that they don't directly give you the raw data of acceleration related to speed. They give you speed as a function of time, so you can export the raw speed data, but they give you a fused acceleration index that is a fusion between displacement acceleration and the inertial unit that's in the back. So we are going soon to publish some data with people at Paris Saint-Germain, and they used the Apex, but they got the raw data by post-processing it. So maybe, I guess, the companies will update their systems to include this type of approach and dig deeper into that. And I hope they will do it with accuracy, not only with marketing. This is the point.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, and sorry, one more thing is that I won't cite the companies, but I have had access to raw cloud of data with other companies that are minor and cheaper, or that are sampling with a lower sampling rate. And for this specific purpose, maybe for top speed, it's okay. But for this specific purpose, it doesn't give valid clouds of data.
Okay, thank you, JB. Another question from Johan Svensson. Principle of individualization. Why do you think coaches in general are reluctant, afraid to individualize, for example, group players, as you mentioned, instead of doing the same for everyone?
Honestly, well, first, clearly it takes time. It's additional work, definitely. So there's one part of the explanation is laziness. Definitely, it's easier and more comfortable, everything. But the other thing is, maybe we were not aware enough about the interest and about the fact that even if the players look the same, even if they sprint the same, we were not aware that they could have some different mechanics, some different profiles. So I guess now there's going to be two schools of thought. Some people who will try to address the players a bit differently, and this is changing over time. And some people who will stick to the very classical one-size-fits-all methods. But if you compare with other sports like track and field, or it's pretty obvious that you need to individualize even a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you said before, especially in the already developed players, elite players that has developed the force and velocity, if you want to have the effect.
Yeah. But still, even if you have an elite group, you will find some places where that's the philosophy of training. If you're a coach, you have in mind that anybody
anytime, even Rafael Nadal right now can still have some, places of change or improvement. Otherwise, you would not coach.
Yeah. You mentioned, I have a question here, because and I remind the audience to write more questions in the chat room there. But meanwhile, you mentioned fatigue, maybe indicating fatigue with this method. How would you do that? Would you do it with this large cloud with maybe weeks of training, or individual sessions?
Sorry, I missed the very beginning.
Okay.
Would I do what?
The indication of fatigue with this method.
Yeah.
How would you do that in a practical sense, and the easiest way?
So to me, first we have to define correctly the minimum unit of time of football to provide a cloud of data that is consistent. And this is the very nice work that the student did with Paris Saint-Germain. She took some cloud of data, and she tried to find the minimum amount of football minutes to provide a stable, so more is not needed. So first, we have to define that. Let's say that it's 2 sessions, very, very intense, complete sessions. Fatigue is not going to be within the session. So the in situ profile is not able to identify fatigue within a session. But I think it's able to identify long-term fatigue, chronic fatigue. For example, if I have August, September, October with the same profile, and then my November is completely off, I know that something is going on. And if I don't have any specific clear reasons, like a change in position or a change in tactics to explain that, I know that there is fatigue. So I think it's going to be more adapted to chronic and long-term fatigue than acute fatigue. And this is why I think the classical sprint test still has some interesting role to play. Because if you ask me a 30-meter all-out test and I am fatigued, then yes, you will find something here. So one is acute, the other one is chronic.
So if you want to both measure the training effect of a period of the season and try to detect fatigue, chronic fatigue, then you would suggest to do both this cloud with a lot of sessions, but also include the 30-minute sprints. Is it like 3 times 30 minutes or only 1 30-minute, or how do you do that?
So the overall answer is yes, because in this very specific context, it will give you 2 different informations. And the acute fatigue, you can't identify it with in situ profile. Then, how many trials? That's very simple. In my practice, I have 2 trials. So 2 times 30 meter with rest. And the players should be within 2 to 5% variability. Trained people, when you ask them all out exercises, they have very low variation. So sometimes when I don't have a choice, they do only 1, but I make sure that it's really, really all out. But, it's better to have 2 and take the best one, or the average of 2, yes. Which may also induce fatigue, but that's the story. It is testing.
I'm thinking about this. If you relate the 30 minutes, if you do it weekly, often you do like large spaces or maximum speed sessions once a week, maybe in a professional team. And then you can relate it to the training volume the period before, and maybe you can optimize that for the individual player.
To tell you the truth, we are doing a lot of thinking and analysis with my colleagues in Italy who have a very large database. Our unit of thinking is 1 week plus the game. This is we have 50 points in a season.
Okay. Here's a question from Enea Moretti. To use the in situ model, players need to train all out in both short distances and long distances. However, we know that that is often not the case in one single session, and sometimes also not even during several sessions. Also, we mentioned in the beginning that we need to expose players to all-out raw sprinting if you want to improve sprinting performance. So why not have all players sprint for the main purpose of training exposure and get the testing in the same time?
So in my ideal world, yes, there would be 2 all-out sprints at least per week for training, prevention, and testing. But in the reality, it sometimes doesn't occur like this. So I totally agree. Maybe in some contexts, take the Barca, for example, it is very well known that they have a lot of small-sided games and that they sometimes in the week don't reach maximum speed. Some players, some key players. So if the style of the coach, if the culture of the club doesn't allow you to cover the entire cloud, small sprints, intermediate, long sprints, then yes, even 1 week, even 2 weeks will not be enough. So you have to make sure that the training content allow the players over, let's say, 4 sessions, 5 sessions, 1 week to cover the entire thing. This is why my 45 minutes training at home was a bit intense. I think I did 6 kilometers because I was sure to be the guy on the pitch who was, doing all the types of run. If you're a coach, you want to slow me down, but I wanted to know if it was possible in 45 minutes. But then, yes, maybe it's not possible in 2 weeks if the style of training is not complete. But this is why we add the game, because we know that during a game, you cannot choose, you cannot avoid. If you have a short sprint to do, you will do it. If you have a long sprint to do, you will do it. So this is why it's important that the players carry the GPS or have a good video system during games. Because I observed in a professional club in France, some profiles that were very good, very complete over 90 minutes of an official game. And the week after and the week before in training only, it was absolutely not complete. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think we are 7 minutes past deadline here, but thank you very much, JB, for your time.
Thank you.
And really nice and interesting presentation and answering the questions. Och jag vill också påminna er lyssnare att gå in på hemsidan på Elitprojektet på SVFFs hemsida och håll utkik efter kommande webbinarium som vi kommer sprida. Thank you very much, JB, and you all have a nice evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.